I wonder if there's a single place in the whole world that's never had a story. I bet not. I just about guarantee you there's no places like that in America. Every little square of it, every place you stomp your foot, that's where something happened. Something wild, maybe something nobody knows about, but something. You can fall out of the sky and right into some old forgotten storybook. John Boyce, 17,776. I've included this quote from John Boyce, a sports journalist who often investigates unknown and overlooked stories, because his work has been highly inspirational for this video. Our story begins here in Salem, Oregon at the state capitol in 1935. And here it is around 6:30 p.m. on April 25th, when a janitor noticed flames erupting out of an elevator shaft from the basement level. As citizens of Salem rushed into the burning building to try and salvage what important artifacts they could, fire patrols from as far away as Portland were called in. One of the firefighting carts used that night is still on display at the Salem Fire Department. In the meantime, thousands of local residents gathered around the blaze while tourists flew in from as far away as Seattle to watch the burning spectacle. Insurance reports estimate the cost of the fire to be around $2 million. Adjusted for inflation, that would be over $40 million in 2023. Now, almost a century later, the Oregon State Capitol Foundation, as part of its Oregon State Governor's Portrait Project, is attempting to track down, locate, and catalog various portraits and other works of art relating to Oregon State governors which may have survived this 1935 fire. Unfortunately, the majority of these artworks have been lost to history. Of the 31 governors who were in office before the fire, we only have portraits for 9 of them: Gaines, Lane, Davis, Pennoyer, Painlord, Gear, Chamberlain, West, and Meyer. As for the rest, well, we just don't know. What we do know is that the process of tracking down these portraits will ultimately begin here at the Oregon State Capitol. And here is the Golden Pioneer statue that stands atop the Capitol's Art Deco rotunda, which, after it was constructed in 1938, was variously described as a paint can, squirrel cage, and tree stump. The longest-serving president in Oregon Senate history, Peter Courtney, describes the building as looking like a bowling trophy. The building was designed by Trowbridge and Livingston, the same firm who designed Rikers Island in New York. Goodhue Livingston's great-grandfather was a signee of the Declaration of Independence. Here he is pictured at a formal soiree with Elsie Vanderbilt. And here is sculptor Ulrich Ellerhusen, who designed the frescoes depicted on the Capitol's frieze, as well as the 22-foot-tall, 8-ton statue of a woodsman carrying an axe and tarp that sits 140 feet atop the state capitol. Officially the third state capitol, the current building is undergoing renovation, which seems to be a common theme throughout the Oregon State Capitol's history. Current plans seek to earthquake-proof the building, as well as installing shoring walls to act as vaults beneath the lower floors. Almost 4 years before becoming a state, the first Oregon Capitol burned in a fire in which arson was suspected, but no arrests were made. Oregon's temporary capital for the next 17 years was the Holman Building, until construction was completed in 1876 on the second state capitol, which stood almost 60 years until burning down in the 1935 fire. However, all was not lost, as an insurance report from the time describes masonry vaults which contain vital documents that may provide a clue as to where any salvaged Oregon governor's portraits could be. Thanks to federal support and the public backing of Franklin Roosevelt, who attended the new capitol's dedication, the third and current state capitol opened in 1938, a little over 3 years after the fire. Oregon has a long art history, in fact, with Meriwether Lewis making several sketches of flora and fauna in his notebooks during the Corps of Discovery. The earliest listing for an Oregonian art gallery that I can find is for George Hillman's Art Gallery on Front Street in Portland, and comes from this 1871 Salem City Directory, which also includes an advertisement for early Oregon photographer Joseph Buchtel, whose studio produced many portraits of early Oregon politicians. Here is a photo of artist Rowena Owens seated at an easel, taken by Peter Britt, who owned another important early photography studio. The location of Hillman's gallery is 811 NATO Parkway, which is currently a law office. And the fact that it is a law office makes sense, as only 6 or so blocks away is the Mark Hatfield Courthouse. Governor Mark Hatfield was born in Oregon and raised in Salem, here at this house on 1725 Court Street, only about 6 blocks away from where the Capitol now stands. However, in 1935, when Hatfield was living here, the Capitol grounds looked something more like this construction montage provided by the Oregon Secretary of State website. When the second Capitol building burned down in 1935, the flames could be seen as far away as Corvallis. Now, in snowy conditions, Trowbridge and Livingston's crew worked to complete construction on the new Capitol in record time, finishing the building in under 3 years with an exterior of white marble hauled in from Vermont. Here's the state capitol from a slightly different angle shortly after its completion in 1938, taken from an advertisement for the Beaver Engraving Company based out of Salem. I took this advertisement from this 1939 Clarion Annual Yearbook, which I bought off of eBay. Here are some photographs of a Salem High bonfire which, quote, got out of control and blistered the camera. Here is the inscription of Lucille Bairns, the owner of the yearbook, although the page on which her photograph was located was torn out. Another photograph missing is that of Frank Herbert, the author of Dune. A photograph which is in the book is that of Mark Hatfield, a junior at the time, as well as the 17-year-old Hatfield's signature. In 1935, Hatfield was 12 years old when he heard the shouts of those responding to the Capitol fire happening 6 blocks away from his house. He was one of those citizens who rushed inside the building to attempt and retrieve items before they were destroyed by the flames. Many of these items were taken to the old Salem Armory, which functioned as the interim Capitol in the wake of the fire. For his own official gubernatorial portrait, Hatfield chose to have a sculptural bust made by R.W. Bain, a decision perhaps influenced by this bust of President and former Oregon resident Herbert Hoover, who Hatfield admired and wrote his master's thesis on. Here's Hatfield presenting the bust alongside President Eisenhower. He is not the only Oregon governor to have sculptures, however. Here is a bust of Governor Vic Attia from the Three Rivers Museum. He also has a full-size sculpture at PDX Airport. And while not an official governor of Oregon, Cecil Andrews was born and raised in Hood River and went on to become the governor of neighboring Idaho. One of the portraits Hatfield could have saved was that of Governor Joseph Lane, who we can see in this photograph by Joseph Buchtel. Before Salem was settled upon, several cities contended to be the capital of Oregon, including Eugene, Corvallis, and Oregon City, which Lane himself approved of. However, future governors would contentiously move the seat to Marion County. Here we have the Buchtel photo from 1879, 3 years after the second Capitol was opened. Beside it is an engraving from a book on Oregon history by Julian Hawthorne, son of author Nathaniel Hawthorne, and finally is an oil painting of Lane based on the previous engraving, which currently hangs in the Floyd Lane House Museum in Roseburg. A house Lane himself never lived in, but which was owned by his daughter, Sarah, and her husband. The search for governors' portraits continues across the country at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., which also houses a copy of the Hatfield bust. It is in their archives in which I found my first governor portrait, that of George Chamberlain from his time as a U.S. congressman. Chamberlain came from the political Archer family out of Maryland, and his uncle, a congressman himself, served time in federal prison for embezzling state funds. It was in researching Chamberlain that I came across perhaps the most interesting historic fact about Oregon which I did not previously know. Chamberlain was the first governor to have a woman as his private secretary, Carolyn B. Shelton, who would marry Chamberlain after his first wife passed. Shelton's life itself was rather interesting, as her father mysteriously disappeared during a train trip when she was 7, and her mother died shortly afterward, leaving her in the care of the lawyer who unsuccessfully tried the man for murder of her father. In 1909, Chamberlain was selected to U.S. Senate. Not wanting to be sworn in after other senators, which would officially make them his seniors, Chamberlain left by train 3 days before the official end of his term as governor. Usually, the Secretary of State would assume office, but future Governor Frank Benson was sick in bed, which meant this privilege fell onto Chamberlain's private secretary, Carolyn Shelton, officially making her the first woman governor in American history, 14 years before Nellie Taylor Ross was elected in Wyoming. After performing well as a local district attorney, Chamberlain's political career was jump-started when he was appointed Attorney General by the person whom I consider to be Oregon's most interesting governor, Sylvester Pennoyer. Born in New York and a graduate of Harvard Law, Pennoyer had been a Democrat but changed to the Populist Party after a land dispute with a neighbor went to federal court and the judge ruled against him, forever souring Pennoyer toward Washington, D.C., federal politicians, and bourbon Democrats. During Pennoyer's administration, Chinese exclusion acts on the West Coast had resulted in a string of anti-Asian violence. In a telegram such as this, President Grover Cleveland implored Governor Pennoyer to get a hold on things before they got out of control. Pennoyer responded with a telegram in kind which read, "I will attend to my business, let the president attend to his." Upon Cleveland's inauguration, Pennoyer refused to let the National Guard use the state's cannon to celebrate. He even issued his own Thanksgiving proclamation so that he wouldn't have to share the holiday with the White House. Pennoyer's disdain was not only for Cleveland, he also famously snubbed President Benjamin Harrison by refusing to meet him at the state line upon a presidential visit to the state. And when Harrison's train car did arrive in Salem, Pennoyer made him wait 10 minutes before finally showing up. Pennoyer's ire was not even exclusively reserved to animate objects. He vetoed a Bull Run water project because he claimed that the glacier water would cause goiters in the fairer sex. So where does that leave us? Well, luckily there are citizen journalists like Claire Withicum of the Seattle Times, who wrote about her successful search for a portrait of her great-great-grandfather, Oregon's 15th state governor, James Withicum. In conjunction with individuals like Claire, groups like the Douglas County Historical Society, Portland State University, and various other amateur historians throughout the Pacific Northwest, the Oregon State Capitol Foundation has managed to discover several portraits which have remained lost or unknown for almost a century. But the project is far from over, and the OSCF would like to invite anyone interested to be on the lookout and get involved by contacting the OSCF and letting us know of any potential portraits or other works of art relating to Oregon governors that you might have in an attic or have seen in your school, museum, or place of business.